And now I have the great privilege of introducing Professor Mark Leuchter. Mark is a distinguished professor of Hebrew Bible and Jewish Studies at Temple University. He's the director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Temple University. He's also a prolific author. He just finished his fifth book, which is coming out. It just appeared in November, but he has four other books, Levites and the Boundaries of Israelite Identity, Samuel and the Shaping of Tradition, The Polemics of Exile in Jeremiah, Josiah's Reform and Jeremiah's Scroll, Historical Calamity and Prophetic Response, and then the book that we were thinking about bringing him here for is called An Empire Far and Wide, the Achaemenid Dynastic Myth and Jewish Scribes in the Late Persian Period. Part of the reason we wanted to bring Mark was because the Levi Center, along with the Port Avud Institute, is actually doing a conference later this week where we're bringing about 20 scholars from all over the world on the Hebrew Bible in its Persian context. So Mark's book is one of the, I think, important new books on that topic. But also Mark, I've known him for more than 20 years. I met him when he was a recent PhD student, and I was a young scholar at UCLA. And I've seen him grow as a scholar, and he's one of the more interesting, intellectually diverse, and also entertaining scholars and speakers that I've heard. And I thought he would be a fantastic person to give a public lecture on this august occasion. So I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Professor Leuchter and on behalf of the Center. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, everybody. By the way, just pronounce my last name any way you want. The Germans are always telling me I'm getting it wrong, and the last thing you want to do is upset them. So, listen, I've come out to UCLA a couple times, almost always because of my relationship with Bill and Kate Bonishow, who's here as well. But it's really, really nice. I mean, really nice to be able to come out and meet other people who are associated with the center and with Jewish studies here, and get a sense of the community that surrounds the community here. And the truth is that over the last, since 2007 or so, maybe a little bit earlier, I started coming out to Los Angeles more often because my sister lived out here, and I was just mentioning before, I when I'm not doing academic stuff, I kind of work in the rock and roll world a little bit. I make guitar effects for people, and there's tons of musicians out here, so I come out here and I work with some of them. And Los Angeles just sort of feels like a second home at this point. Like I don't know the city that well, but the parts that I have gotten to know, like it just feels real easy. And I always feel so comfortable coming out here, and it's really a treat to be here. So I'm very grateful for your hospitality. When it comes to research and theories about Mel Brooks, I think we should use the word theories really gingerly. I'm not sure I have theories. I just have opinions. And I think Mel Brooks probably wouldn't want us to have theories about him. I think he would want us to have opinions. So before I really get started, I want to actually, hold on, let me get my PowerPoint going here. Before I get started, what I want to do is I want to ask you what your favorite Mel Brooks movie is. Because everybody's got one, and you wouldn't be here if you didn't have one. What? Which one? Young Frankenstein. Okay, I heard another one. You too? The Producers. Okay. Yep. Blazing Saddles. Very good. I mean, so far I'm liking what I'm hearing. Oh yeah. Spaceballs. That's the one. That for me, that's the one. My favorite moment in Spaceballs is, now Lone Star, you see that evil will always triumph over good because good is dumb. That's right. So it's just classic. It says it all there, doesn't it? So listen, we all have our favorite Mel Brooks movies. And, I'm going to, by the way, just so you know how seriously I'm taking this, I wrote out my speech, which I almost never do, and I'm wearing a tie, this is the first time I've worn a tie in probably 7 years. I'm surprised I remembered how to do the whole thing. Can I? I may need to. Depends on how frenetic I get up here. So what I want to do is I actually want to share with you my favorite Mel Brooks scene in any Mel Brooks movie, and it's actually from Young Frankenstein. I don't know if it's my favorite Mel Brooks movie, but I always love watching it, and I can't get enough of it. And this is the scene. I mean, there's two scenes. There's the putting on the Ritz scene, which, of course, you got to love that one. But this one is the one that sticks with me. Y'all ready for this? All right. I have sound on here, so hopefully we can make the sound work. But here we go.
Hi, God. May I speak to you for a moment?
It's off your lungs.
Sit down, won't you? Thank you. Oh, up here.
Thank you.
Now, that brain that you gave me, was it half velvet? Top. Good. Would you mind telling me whose brain I did put in?
And you won't be angry.
I will not be angry.
Abby someone.
Abby someone. Abby who?
Abby normal.
Abby Normal.
I'm almost sure that was the name.
Are you saying that I put an abnormal brain into a 7.5 foot long, 54-inch wide gorilla? Is that what you're telling me?
Okay. That's enough right there. So, in what feels like a previous life, I actually worked in film. I worked in documentary films when I was living in Toronto, and I was a cinematographer. And I used to love running around, shooting these very, very low-budget independent films on super 16mm camera. And I think one of the reasons that I love Young Frankenstein so much is that it really evokes all those old 1930s horror films that were shot in black and white. And it's shot beautifully. It's a really beautifully photographed film. But it's also an amazing film because it uses the cinematic medium against itself. Nothing is cinematic with scare quotes is actually happening in that sequence. It's one long take with a couple cutaways to Terry Garr. But it's still an amazing scene because of the casting and the performance and the writing and the pacing. There's so many things that go into making a work of cinema, and not just something that you're watching for entertainment. And I think that what we're seeing in a scene like this is a synthesis on a very, very high order. There's a real strong relationship. I've been doing a lot of work on this over the last couple of years. There's a strong relationship between religion and language and art. And all of these things seem to have emerged all at once in human history. My old teacher from University of Michigan, Roy Rappaport, was one of the great anthropologists. And he passed away in 1999, but his last book delved into this issue a little bit more. And he made the case that religion and language emerged basically at the same time, about 200,000 years ago. And the reason why is because language gave us the capacity to lie. All animals can deceive. Well, not all animals. I mean, a jellyfish can't really deceive you, but my dogs deceive me all the time. But what my dogs can't do is they can't lie. My little dog can't, go over to me and say, the big dog is threatening to overthrow your place in the house. I mean, he's not doing that. Dogs can't lie because dogs can't talk. But we can talk, and therefore we can lie. So religion as a concept, I'm not talking about theology, I'm not talking about ritual regulations and things like that, but just as a concept, religion becomes something that emerges right around the same time language emerges as a way for clans and tribes to have some kind of unassailable truth that is transcendent and timeless, that they can use as a barometer to check whether or not they are being confronted with a lie. And obviously, it gets more complicated than that as time goes on, but the relationship between religion and language is very powerful, the relationship between language and art is very powerful, and the relationship between religion and art is very powerful. All these things emerge right as human societies are starting to emerge. All of them speak in abstract, symbolic ways to human experience. And so when we see, Friedrich Frankenstein, that's Frankenstein, sitting and talking with Igor. And, we don't need to even hear what they're saying. We can see Marty Feldman's face, and we can see Gene Wilder's, sort of measured insanity that he's keeping under wraps as he's playing this character. And we symbolically, on some kind of intuitive level, know that something hilarious is going to happen. But, we laugh because there's something horrible also happening underneath it all. And I think that's what makes for great cinema, and that's what makes for great literature, that there's a deep truth in classic literature that is intimated by the language that we encounter in these texts, in classical Jewish texts as well. And I have an article coming out in another volume suggesting that Jewish cinema should be understood and read the same way that we read classical Jewish texts. There's a transmission process, there's a communal engagement process, there's a process of triggering memories, communal and cultural memories. These are all parts of Jewish cinema as much as they are parts of Jewish text making. And I think that Mel Brooks's films really fall into that category. So having said that, I'd like to begin reading from this. And, I don't like to be very formal, as you can probably tell by now, but I thought, I'm going out to Los Angeles. You guys are all fancy. I better get formal. So here we go. So there's a great moment in The Simpsons in an early episode where Krusty the Clown comes out as Jewish. And Homer is surprised and Lisa tells him that many entertainers are Jewish, including Lauren Bacall, Dinah Shore, William Shatner, and Mel Brooks. And Homer is shocked and responds, "Mel Brooks is Jewish?" And so I often show that this Krusty the Clown clip to my students, my undergrad students, and over time, some of those names have become a little less familiar to them. And many of my students have heard of Shatner, but maybe not Lauren Bacall, and fewer still know who Dinah Shore was. However, they all know who Mel Brooks is. Brooks somehow perseveres. Most of my students still know his name, and those who don't know his name know his work when I tell them that he's the creative force behind it. Brooks's brand of Jewish humor endures because he somehow manages to network into it conceptual kegs that never run dry. One of those kegs, maybe the biggest one, is his satirical concept of the larger Gentile world that surrounds him and his fellow American Jews. Now, he does this a lot, obviously. Rabbi Tuckman instead of Friar Tuck in Robin Hood Men in Tights. Bialystock and Bloom in The Producers. Yogurt instead of Yoda in Spaceballs, whose catchline, we will recall, is, "May the Schwartz be with you." Really, the list is virtually endless with this guy, so let's not even get into the stuff he did as a writer on TV when he worked on Get Smart, which is my favorite TV show of all time, or earlier in his career when he wrote on Your Show of Shows. But, let's really be honest. Blazing Saddles really takes the cake when it comes to taking potshots at Gentiles from the cultural purview as an American Jew. Blazing Saddles is the parade example. Embedded within Blazing Saddles is a moment in Brooks's cinema that is simultaneously horrifying and funny, and then horrifying all over again because it's funny. So, if you've seen the movie, as I know many of you have, a white politician installs a black sheriff into town in order to attain a particular goal, and we'll see what that goal is. So, Sheriff Bart, a black man who's deliberately installed by a local politician named Hedy Lamarr. Sorry, that's Headley. That was a joke. If you saw the movie, you know what I'm talking about. This black sheriff is installed as sheriff of the town to infuriate the white-bread citizens. The town is called Rockridge. And he goes out for a morning stroll one morning. As he's walking, he says good morning to an old woman who passes him by, and she replies only with, "Up yours," followed by the N-word. Now, anybody here, you remember that scene? Okay, yeah, it's kind of an unforgettable scene. It's played for laughs, and we do laugh. Maybe because we just don't expect so bold and naked a display of racism from a sweet old lady. And laughter is what we do sometimes when we're extremely uncomfortable. The comedy in the scene is the result of many things that really aren't very funny, and it wouldn't take much effort to figure out why. But it's the next scene that really contains the payoff. We fade into a close-up of a depressed Sheriff Bart with his friend Jim, played by Gene Wilder, seated next to him, offering some words of context and comfort. Here's the clip.
What did you expect? Welcome, sonny. Make yourself at home. Marry my daughter. You've got to remember that these are just simple farmers. These are people of the land, the common clay of the New West. You know, morons.
Okay. Morons. Of course, Bart breaks out into laughter. And dress it up in whatever flowery platitudes or euphemisms you can. Simple farmers, the common clay of whatever, and proud deplorables. In the end, these people of the land are morons. And that's common for Brooks. He likes to skewer the perpetrators. He likes to ridicule their values. He strips away the glamour and the pretense of nobility and reveals the beast for what it is. In Blazing Saddles, the specific moniker identifying the beast is people of the land. And I would argue that this is not accidental or incidental. Toward the beginning of Blazing Saddles, as ideas are floated for getting the people of Rockridge, who all have the last name Johnson, by the way, to vacate their town, Taggart, played memorably by Slim Pickens, suggests, okay, well, let's just watch.
Unfortunately, there is one thing that stands between me and that property. The rightful owners. There must be some way of scaring them off, dragging them out, getting rid of every human being alive. Down the hall to the left.
No, sir.
What? You do? What?
I know how we can run everybody out of Rockridge.
How?
We'll kill the firstborn male child in every household.
Too Jewish.
It's too Jewish. Now, Brooks has spent so many years making us laugh at the most elaborately staged fart jokes that we may sometimes forget that beneath the clown is a profound intellectual. And among the various classics he knows very well, we should include the Bible. Brooks knows his biblical lore and the language emerging from it. So, ergo, the joke that we just saw. So we should ask, is it possible that the people of the land reference is also a self-aware reference to a particular Jewish or biblical trope? The title of my paper is a dead giveaway that my answer to this is a resounding yes. To be sure, the term people of the land, or Am Haaretz in Hebrew, has a long biblical afterlife, but Brooks's critique aligns far more closely with what we find in the biblical prophets, especially Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Let me briefly summarize my view of who the Am Haaretz was in Israelite antiquity, and I should note that scholars in my field are divided on the categories and definitions. Most recently, our own Professor Bill Schneidewin, seated right over there, has written about the contribution of this group of people to the development of biblical literature and the emergence of scribal traditions in ancient Israel. And I find his discussion compelling. But unlike today, where a degree of literacy and literary sophistication is something that almost everybody in our society possesses, literacy and scribal skill in the ancient world was a hallmark of power, real and social economic power. So the first thing that we can say about the Am Haaretz, the people of the land, is that they had that kind of power. And there's no better precondition for being the butt of a joke than being powerful. A good comedian knows this. You punch up, you don't punch down. Punching down is what bad and lazy comedians do. Larry the Cable Guy punches down. Carlos Mencia punches down. Unfortunately, even Dave Chappelle has punched down in recent years, but he built his reputation as a comic genius by punching up at the powerful. And while our culture has evolved over 2,700 years or so, our cognition and what we find to be funny really hasn't changed all that much. So the Am Haaretz, powerful people, and ripe for some pretty harsh ribbing. So let me get back to what I think we can say about them. Most would agree, at least in my field, that the Am Haaretz constitute a sort of landed gentry, elites of the rural sector in the kingdom of Judah with connections among the powerful in Jerusalem. Think less Uncle Jesse from the Dukes of Hazzard and more J.R. Ewing from Dallas. You guys remember that show? Good, my students don't, unfortunately. They receive a number of mentions in the Book of Kings and a powerful political caste that could and did intervene in royal affairs. That's what they were. It's difficult to determine when this group originated. My guess is that the title they bear, Am Haaretz, probably dates from the early monarchic period, that is, somewhere around the 10th century BCE. There are all sorts of reasons for this, but I don't want to get into that right now. We can discuss it in the Q&A if you want. But even though I think the title Am Haaretz probably emerged in the early monarchic period, I would argue that their actual historical origins go all the way back to earliest emergent Israel, those initial generations of highland settlers who show up in the material record at the outset of the Iron Age around 1200 BCE, as attested in the Merneptah inscription in this slide. though it is likely that they would have become an organized political caste only with the rise of the monarchy. The biblical narrative elsewhere makes reference to other people as Am Haaretz in different ways, but the sociological basis for each and all of these references is very likely the Am Haaretz of the Judahite monarchy. So we need to dig a little bit deeper, because the Am Haaretz were not characterized simply by their rural social location, but also by a more mythological connection to the landscape on which they resided. Even the name Am Haaretz is suggestive of a mythological status assigned to the members of this group. Am, after all, means more than just people or nation. It also means kin or kindred of. So kin or kindred of what? The Aretz? Well, the land? Maybe. But Aretz in ancient northwestern Semitic discourse also means underworld. The oracles of the prophet Hosea, who was active around 730 BCE, carry this valence when they mention the term Aretz. It is not simply land, but the cosmic and chthonic dimensions within it, where the dead reside, a Hebrew parallel to the Greek concept of Hades. The reference to Baal at the end of the passage that you see in this slide, who was a Canaanite deity who rose from the dead, drives home the double entendre. And this is, of course, the image that comes into my mind when I think of the underworld, but it's much more complicated than just Beetlejuice. The Aretz and Am Haaretz may therefore be a metonym for those residing in the underworld, the dead. Now, if I'm right, by the way, I did see the dead in Cleveland in 1991, and it was the day before classes were supposed to start at University of Michigan, and I didn't do anything, but the guy who was supposed to drive us back was on something, and he drove 300 miles in the wrong direction. We wound up in Kentucky, and I wanted to get to class for the first day of class, and I blew a complete gasket, hissy fit, and I threw him out of the front seat, and I drove the car all the way back to Ann Arbor, and we got there 10 minutes before classes started. So, and that, thank you. Yeah, we are determined, we Michiganders. Anyway, if I'm right, then to be part of Am Haaretz means that you're not just a landlubber, you're a kinsman of the dead, a trustee of their power, the arbiter of their cosmic knowledge emanating from the underworld, spooky powers. The Am Haaretz, then, were fixtures of the hinterland who maintained some numinous status quo mediating the landscape, the population, the dead, and the sacral culture shared by all of these. With this in mind, I think we should turn to the prophets I mentioned in the title of today's talk. Now, what is a prophet? Okay, this is a big question, and people in my field have been bickering about it for 200 years. Fortunately for all of us, I, Mark Leuchter, graduate of Hillel Day School of Metropolitan Detroit, class of 1987, will put that all to rest right now, at least for our current purposes. A prophet is a spokesperson or representative of the divine. There are many ways that this could be manifested in antiquity, but at least within the biblical tradition, a prophet is someone who speaks on behalf of God to the people of Israel. And though lots of prophets perform their prophecies orally, they reach us now as literary works, as classics of Jewish literature, really, akin to the remarks I made earlier. There's one more thing I want to stress, too. Prophets were not fortune tellers. They were not like Karnak the Magnificent or the Amazing Kreskin or whatever that guy's name was. In fact, if I had to give a modern example of what Israel's prophets were often like, I'd use this one.
Think about it. Religion has actually convinced people that there's an invisible man living in the sky who watches everything you do every minute of every day. And the invisible man has a special list of 10 things he does not want you to do. And if you do any of these 10 things, he has a special place full of fire and smoke and burning and torture and anguish where he will send you to live and suffer and burn and choke and scream and cry forever and ever till the end of time. But he loves you.
All right. There were the two greatest comedians of all time, I think, were Richard Pryor and George Carlin. And Carlin's performances, I mean, Carlin was a lapsed Catholic and he was an atheist, but the way he performed is not unlike the way ancient Israelite prophets performed. Everything was rehearsed, or not everything was rehearsed, but there were conventions of performance. There were sort of patterns that prophets had to follow. Their bodies were involved in it, like his body is involved in it. And most importantly, as I wrote down here, prophets were social critics. They stood at the margins and pointed out what was wrong with the center, who was abusive, who was hypocritical, etc. They did think about what the future might bring, but mostly in light of what people were doing in the present, especially in terms of ritual, religious belief, and how these secured power. So I want to look at 3 passages that bear witness to the dramatic disruption of a status quo. A text from the book of Jeremiah, a text from the book of Ezekiel, and a text from the book of Kings, the latter of which is regarded by all serious scholars as redacted by scribes with sympathies to the prophetic tradition of their day. So this text qualifies in a way as prophetic. Within the traditional Jewish biblical canon, of course, it falls under the category Nevi'im, or prophets. So insofar as Jewish literature is concerned, it's a prophetic text. There are actually 2 brief texts from Kings that we should look at, and here they are. So the first one reads, Nebuchadnezzar carried all Jerusalem into exile, all the officers and fighting men, and all the skilled workers and artisans, a total of 10,000. Only the enfeebled people of the land were left. And the second one has a lot of similarities to the first one. It's from a different account of the same event. And the captain of the guard took Sariah, the chief priest, and Zephaniah, the second priest, yada, 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 yada. All the people that were found in the city, they were mustered together. They mustered the people of the land, and 70 men of the people of the land that were found hiding in the city. So what we have here are 2 notices regarding the people of the land at the very end of the monarchic period as the Babylonians are destroying Jerusalem. Now, I know it's difficult sometimes to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem, so let me brighten your day by showing you pictures of my dogs. The big one is Milo ben Mordechai Halevi. I'm not kidding. The little one is Ezra Tzvi Schwartz. Those are their actual names. Anyway, back to the King's passage. By the way, this is how I managed to keep undergraduates interested. You gotta throw in a couple jokes. A, to keep them curious, and B, to let some of these ideas settle and sort of, become part of their broader thought process. Yeah, please.
Do you really call them by their full names when they come on?
Sometimes.
Okay.
I will say that the second to last book that I wrote, which is a history of the Levites in ancient Israel, I dedicated to Milo because his full name is Milo ben Mordechai Halevi. So, and if he's a Levite, he deserves a book named after him. So, the Levites were a very permeable group of people. So, anyway, but yes, I sometimes will call them by their full names. But most of the time, I have shortened forms for them because they're usually getting into trouble, especially the little one. If you ever want to know where the little one is, just follow the path of destruction. You'll find him. All right, let's get back to the good book. Both of these passages are part of a larger account of the Babylonian conquest of Judah. The first passage stresses that conditions are so disrupted that the Am Haaretz have been, as I said here, enfeebled. Many understand this verse simply as describing the Babylonians not caring about the poorest people of the hinterland, and they translate the original Hebrew as the poorest people of the land, but I think that misses the point. We know from archaeological surveys that most of the Judahite population was not carried into exile, but were instead internally displaced within the homeland. So it wouldn't just be the poorest. Rather, the Am Haaretz would have, in some part, remained. But under such conditions, residing within the land but removed from ancestral estates and tombs, how could the Am Haaretz have numinous or social power under such conditions? I mean, how could they be anything but enfeebled? The second passage comes from a different archival source and tells us that 60-ish of the Am Haaretz were actually taken captive by the Babylonians. But notice where they are taken from. They are huddled like scared mice in the city, severed from the agrarian source of their power. But not for long, because after being taken captive, they're killed, and killed away from the tomb spaces where they might have normally been interred and become the powerful dead themselves. So in these two passages, some of the Am Haaretz survive, some don't, but as a social category, they've been undone, they've been unmade, and barred from any claims of power or even a social or burial location. Admittedly, this is more Bergman than Brooks, but it gives us, by the way, this means people of the land in Swedish, a film by Ingmar Bergman. But it gives us important context for looking at the passages in Jeremiah and Ezekiel that make mention of the Am Haaretz. Biblical scholars generally place the contents of Jeremiah and Ezekiel in the same era and the events depicted in Kings. All are really a product of an ancient Judaism dealing with newly imposed conditions of the Babylonian conquest. But Jeremiah and Ezekiel provide hot takes on the Am Haaretz that are different in tone, if not in substance. Let's view the Jeremiah passage first. So in Jeremiah chapter 34, we read, "The princes of the land and the princes of Jerusalem, the officials and the priests, and all the people of the land, the Am Haaretz, that pass between the parts of the calf. It's describing a ritual where animals are cut up and made into like a little path. I will give them into the hands of their enemies and into the hands of them that seek their life. And the dead bodies shall be for food unto the fowls of the heavens and to the beasts of the earth. Yes, I know. Hilarious. But then again, let's think about what's actually happening here. The setting for Jeremiah 34 is a covenant ceremony in Jerusalem where the kings and the elites release their slaves according to the legislation in Deuteronomy. Apparently, this ritual somehow also included a rite involving the chopping up of animals and a ceremonial stroll between the parts, similar to a famous episode in the book of Genesis where Abraham does this with God. But it's only a ritual release of the slaves. As soon as the ritual ends, the participants again enslave the poor. That, in and of itself, is comical, but not in a funny way. It's a parody of what ritual and covenant are supposed to mean, and it's a sign that the people like the Am Haaretz who are entrusted with these sacred rites are completely oblivious to how any of this works, which would carry a comic element because the chapter makes clear that this farcical ceremony is taking place while the Babylonian army is literally at the city gates waiting to invade. Jeremiah isn't having any of this, and he brings his A game when it comes to throwing comic shade. Not only will their farcical ceremony not work, it will have the opposite effect, and those who chopped up the animals and cast their parts on the ground will suffer the very fate of those animals. I should note that the threat of non-burial is a huge source of anxiety in Israelite religion for a couple different reasons. First, it's a source of dishonor to the surviving family, suggesting that they are landless and have no space to bury their dead. But more importantly, non-burial means that one cannot enter the underworld and join their departed ancestors through the family tomb. And that's where the reference to the Am Haaretz is important, because the prophet's rebuke here ridicules their claim to power and authority. I would argue that the prophet is essentially making the same jokes as Mel Brooks. The people of the land are morons, albeit for a reason different than that provided in Blazing Saddles. So I want to turn now to Ezekiel's visions. Ezekiel was a contemporary of Jeremiah, but he came from a different religious and intellectual corner of Judahite society. Ezekiel actually talks about the Am Haaretz far more than Jeremiah does, but one passage strikes me as particularly appropriate. And by the way, what I have here is Ezekiel's commissioning oracle. It's from the very beginning of the book of Ezekiel, which tells us what he first saw when he first became a prophet. But the oracle that I want us to take a look at is this one. So Ezekiel says to his audience, "Say to the people of the land, this is what the sovereign Lord has to say about those living in Jerusalem in the land, or Admat, of Israel. They will eat their food in anxiety and drink their water in despair. For the land/underworld, Artsah, will be stripped of everything in it because of the violence of all who live therein." I know this also is super hilarious, but really this too is a joke, and it satirizes the Am Haaretz, which becomes evident when we think about where Ezekiel is when he cooked up these oracles. Ezekiel is the only prophet in the Hebrew Bible whose entire prophetic career took place in exile, where he was placed in a refugee camp in northern Mesopotamia a few years before the fall of Jerusalem. But unlike those in exile longing to return home, Ezekiel completely repudiated the homeland and rejected those who clung to it in the years leading up to Jerusalem's final destruction. This is why the Am Haaretz reference here is relevant. The meal that Ezekiel describes is like a parody of something that we call the Martzeach, a banquet conducted near ancestral tombs where the numinous power of the dead was shared with the living Am Haaretz, or people of the land. For Ezekiel, the land is stripped from the violence committed by those very people residing in the Aretz. In other words, Ezekiel is saying that the people living on the land have been screwed over by their ancestors, who have deliberately conspired against them. So I think I should wrap things up with a few concluding thoughts. It's clear that humor suffuses these prophetic texts, which is really not all that surprising. The concept of the mighty being brought down low is a staple of humor. And when I say humor, I don't mean like jokey ha-ha humor. It's a different kind of humor. It's a darker humor. It's the kind of humor that I think you might sometimes find on something like The Daily Show in its darker moments, believe it or not. That obviously is not what Brooks is doing in Blazing Saddles, because the citizens of Rockridge are far from mighty. But in a way, they think they are. And they do risk being brought down low. They realize this once the pogrom takes place early on in the film, and they conclude as they sing in church that their town, and I'm quoting here, is turning into shit, unquote. Yet even this turn of events, the presence of a new lawman who might help improve things, doesn't shake their agrarian entitlement. It's their town. It's their land. It's their way of life that shall never be disrupted by corrosive outside forces. For the Johnsons of Rock Ridge, Sheriff Bart's blackness represents the forces that they believe they must repudiate, oblivious to the fact that it's really Hedley Lamar who poses the greatest threat to their existence. So they double down on their identity myths in a way that is really no different than what we find in prophetic texts surveyed above, where the prophets observed that despite a looming crisis, the business as usual behavior of the Am Haaretz is untenable. And like those prophetic texts, Mel Brooks calls the town people of Rock Ridge out on the colossal dumbness of their worldview and mythology. Both Brooks and the prophets use humor to show how ultimately ineffectual such pretenses are, and that consequences lurk just around the corner, be it from Nebuchadnezzar or Hedley Lamar. The last thing I'll say relates to the title of my paper. In ancient Israel, there were debates about whether Israel's first king, Saul, had prophetic qualities, which led to the slogan, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" as reported in the book of Samuel. I've riffed on that in this paper, and I hope I've made the case that Mel Brooks is indeed among the prophets in his own criticism of the people of the land, the Am Haaretz. The difference, though, is that in the prophetic texts, the Am Haaretz are part of the ancient Jewish people, and the biblical narrative eventually offers them opportunities for redemption. In Brooks's film, the people of the land are not Jews, and I'm not sure Brooks is all that interested in letting them off the hook. The final moments of the film intermingle the Old West storyline with the timeline of Brooks's mid-1970s audience. Where did that clip go? Oh, I guess I don't have it loaded in. But if you remember in the film, there's a clip where Harvey Korman somehow takes a taxi cab to a movie theater where Blazing Saddles is actually playing. And so what happens is the film points to the audience of the film as part of the film. It sort of brings you, the viewer, into the film. And what it's suggesting, in a comical way, but in a sort of meta-cinematic way, is that the themes and storylines of this proud people of the land culture that Brooks is skewering is applicable today in our time, when Brooks made the film in the mid-1970s, but also for us today watching the film in our homes or in a movie theater if it's playing as part of some kind of festival circuit. So the meta-cinematic moment indicates that the people of Rock Ridge are not just characters, but archetypes that persist into our own day, represented by those who also cling to identity myths involving racism, religion, blood, and soil. So in the end, Brooks really is among the prophets, because like the prophets and their oracles of doom, Brooks' film reminds us that in reality, despite the fart jokes and the Schnitzengruben and the French mistake, there is no happy ending where an Elmer Bernstein score plays over people riding into the sunset. The people of the land remain with us, clinging to their myths of ethnic identity as they clutch the ground and shout, "Up yours," and worse, as some of these T-shirts suggest. And at this point, as a friend of mine says, they prefer to shout DEI with the hard R. All the while, the enemy has already breached the gate. I know that sounds depressing, but I have some good news. I just saved money on my car insurance by switching to Geico. Thank you very much.
Some time for some questions. This is one of the most unusual biblical studies lectures I have heard in a while.
You knew what you were getting into, Bill.
I did know what I was getting into, and I was happy to get into it. It's really interesting to see the way you weave modern culture into your scholarship, and I'm just wondering, where is this going? Is this a theme that you're going to continue to develop into a major new book, or what's the deal?
It's funny you should ask that, since we talked exactly about this last night at dinner.
Yes.
I have, listen, the last couple of years have been politically fraught, to say the least. And one of the things that I've noticed is that religion and biblical tradition has been invoked to serve decidedly political agendas. And I tell my students this all the time. The idea that there's a division between church and state is completely illusory. There never has been a division between church and state in this country. Religion and politics has always been connected. Every time you take out a quarter to, feed a parking meter, although I think people use apps now, that quarter has the phrase, "In God we trust." And so God is somehow brought into the transaction that enables your car to avoid getting a ticket. Anytime people vote, they vote based on whether somebody advocates for their religious preferences or advocates against other religious preferences, or doesn't advocate for religious preferences at all, but that's still a response to religion. So religion and politics is intimately intertwined, and over the last several years, especially with the rise of the MAGA movement, more so than I ever imagined, I'm seeing a particular sociology of power emerge that draws from ancient traditions, but repackages them for contemporary audiences and tries to map ancient ideas onto contemporary circumstances, which I don't think is very tenable. So the next book idea that I have, which I've actually just started working on even on the plane as I was coming over here, is a book project called Reading David in the Era of Trump. And I want to take a look at the story of how King David comes to power through the prism of a sociological and cognitive study of the power behind Trump's rise to power. I mean, a lot of scholars, as you know, because I know you've written on David extensively, a lot of scholars question how much of the David story is credible, how much of it could have actually happened, how much of it is just fantasy, how much of it is propaganda. But, if 1,000 years from now somebody played you footage of Lindsey Graham before 2016, and then played you footage of Lindsey Graham during the first and now, of course, during the second Trump administration, you wouldn't believe it's the same person. Like, the turnaround has been remarkable. And people who never would have advocated for Trump's brand of politics are totally on board with him now. And I see a lot of those parallels in the rise of David to power. So what I want to do in the book is I want to take a look at how the sociology of power in our own time and the way that human minds work and human cultures work as sort of collections of minds. This is cognitive science and cognitive linguistics, what that tells us about the text regarding David's rise to power, but then what in turn the David traditions tell us about how and why Trump came to power the way that he did, especially among religious groups in this country. So that's the plan.
Well, very good. Well, look forward to that one coming out. Let me open it up to the audience if there are questions.
So how have critics reviewed Mel Brooks's relationship to religion and the culture and the obvious, as you point out, with Blazing Saddles, the kaleidoscope of funny things that I like about it. How do they see it in the dominant culture?
Well, it depends on what you mean by critics. If you mean
movie critics, excuse me, I forgive you. Movie critics.
I don't know enough about the world of movie critics. I did have an email exchange many years ago with Roger Ebert. So I got a little bit of a sense of how movie critics think, and they do think very seriously about films as contemporary sort of scripts for societal organization. So I don't think that they just look at movies. I mean, they might look at some movies as just popcorn fare, and I think that's fine. But I think they look at a lot of movies as serious barometers of trends in society. And I think that they take, at least from some of the stuff that I've read in preparing for this discussion, they take Mel Brooks as a serious artist, even if they don't take any individual moment in his films all that seriously. So when you see two KKK guys with signs, a smiley face on their back saying, "Have a nice day," I mean, that's completely absurd. But it's also serious at the same time. When an old woman says to Cleavon Little, "Up yours, N-word," that is hilariously funny and terrifying because it's hilariously funny, because it's terrifying. We don't know what to do with it. I mean, these are serious things. Brooks was really smart. And when I read a history of Blazing Saddles, Brooks brought Richard Pryor onto the writing team of Blazing Saddles because he did not want to get into the issue of racism without having an outstanding voice of the time from the black community speak to actual experiences and actual memories that community harbored and considered important. Later, Richard Pryor would go on to say that most of his lines in the movie were more like, Mongo only pawn in Game of Life. So it wasn't so much the race stuff, but he consulted on that. So I think that critics recognize that Brooks was really interested in creating some kind of social barometer. And if you think about the films that came out right around that time, The Conversation came out in 1974, lost for Best Picture that year to another Francis Ford Coppola film, Godfather 2. Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon. We're talking about institutional corruption. We're talking about marginalized communities. Then, of course, Taxi Driver was filmed in 1975, a film deeply concerned with racism and the sickness of racism and religion in this country. So Mel Brooks, when we think about Blazing Saddles, I think we need to take a step back and do what a lot of film critics do, and they look at it as part of a trend of cultural expression. And Brooks's individual film is funny to watch, and we watch it because we love it, and it's funny, and it gives us a great laugh. But when we think about the fact that in 1974 to 1976, in that year-and-a-half long span, Brooks's film came out and talked about the very same things that Taxi Driver was talking about, that Serpico was talking about, the lack of faith in institutional leadership in particular, and the ease with which politicians in particular can use racism to pursue and advance an agenda against the interests of the people who think that they're being served. This is something that we see again and again in the films of that era, and I think that Blazing Saddles fits right into it very, very well.
That was a great answer.
Oh, thank you.
Do you think there's some films that are now being pulled and considered racist and not to be shown, like Gone with the Wind? Mm-hmm. Do you think Mel Brooks will have that too? Because even with the humor, there is some racism in there.
I don't know. I kind of think not, because of Mel Brooks' body of work. I think Mel Brooks is himself almost inextricable from his films. Like, the people who directed Gone with the Wind, it was credited to Victor Fleming, right? But there were 4 directors. George Cukor was involved in that. I think Michael Curtiz was involved with it for a while. But eventually it went to Victor Fleming. It's a David O. Selznick production. Those guys aren't in the movie, right? I mean, they're just the powers behind the film, and we don't really associate them and their lives and their personas with it. But you can't separate Mel Brooks from his movies. Brooks's face, his voice, his whole shtick, that sells half the movie. So I think that because people know who Brooks was, or who Brooks is, and still is, he's still going strong, I think that people realize that there's a context for it, the same way that when you watch Pulp Fiction and you listen to all the N-word drops in Pulp Fiction, which come rapid fire, you realize, like, Quentin Tarantino is not a racist. He's challenging our feelings on that word as we hear it said so many times that we become complacent to its significance. We sort of become desensitized to it. All these characters are using the N-word again and again and again in Pulp Fiction, and we're sitting there laughing and watching, and then we have to ask ourselves, why aren't we bothered by this? So I think people will cut slack to certain directors if they know the director's shtick, if they know that it's part of a bigger project. And there's an integrity, I think, to films like Pulp Fiction and films like Blazing Saddles. I mean, Blazing Saddles it's a funny movie, but it takes its humor pretty seriously, and it takes the art of filmmaking very seriously. There's that great shot, of course, where you have the bar brawl, which is, by the way, it's a spoof of Dodge City, which came out in 1939, and there's this huge bar brawl in Dodge City. And the camera zooms back, and it zooms out of the movie studio, and you have this bird's eye view of the entire Warner Brothers movie lot, and then the camera moves over, and it zooms into a different movie studio, and you have a musical being filmed. And then the Western actors break into the musical scene, and all these men who are coded as gay dancers are having, a fist fight with all these very butch, cowboys. I mean, Brooks is calling attention to the art and the process and the politics of filmmaking, and that it's all part of an industry. And I think that's what buys him leeway that other films might not get. But history might prove me wrong. Well, I guess we'll have to see. It's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, hi.
No.
Oh.
All right, so you're sort of uniquely positioned as having a foot in 2 worlds, really the biblical and then sort of the contemporary modern film world. There's a predominance of Jews in the industry for a number of reasons. I'm curious if you've ever thought about sort of how that biblical background has influenced Jewish entertainment, if you will, and how you keep seeing it show, as you have with Brooks.
It's funny that you asked that question because I have an article coming out in the Oxford Handbook on Jewish Cinema called Reading Jewish Films as Jewish Texts. And if you want, I will send you a copy when I get my author's proofs. So, and it's pitched not as like, it's an academic article, but it's pitched for people who don't do research, so like it doesn't get overly technical or anything. I think it might answer your question, but I'm happy to talk about it further if you like. Okay.
I'm curious. Larry's going to get the article, but I don't hear what you guys.
I mean, everybody just email me. I get lonely in my office. Like I got nothing going on. Just send me an email. Like, tell me a joke. By the way, I have my students tell me extra jokes for extra credit at the end of all the exams that I give. And I've been doing this for 15 years, so maybe the next book that I'm going to write is a history of the mother joke as told by undergraduate students over a 15-year period. Because I have a compendium of approximately 3,000 your mother jokes But I'm always looking for more. So send me an email, send me a joke, and I'll send you the article. I think
Aware of the taxi driver's joke book?
I had never heard of this.
Taxi driver, you would ask his rides jokes and trade it, and he published 2 volumes.
Oh my God. What a great idea.
Now this is the professor's.
Well, I mean, listen, I'm not making money off of my other books. I might as well try to make money off of something else. That's okay. I didn't get into this for the money. I clearly got into it for the cocaine parties and the fast cars. So, right. All right, let's continue. Hi.
Thank you so much, Mark. I really enjoyed listening. It became reading the game. What the audience is for a lot of these things. Since I remember the first time I watched Robin Hood Men in Tights, I didn't get a lot of the jokes when I was a kid. I think I must have been 8 years old when I saw that movie for the first time. I didn't catch the references to Rodney King, or I really didn't boil jokes, let's be honest. Who's what do you think the intended audience is? Do you think this has contributed to maybe the lasting impact of Mel Brooks? And then I'm a scholar, I have to bring you back to Hebrew Bible. I like your approach of there's a lot more dark humor in the Hebrew Bible than maybe we've been looking for. How do you think, I really think you're right. Oftentimes we have to prove that the Bible is funny to scholars, right? This is meant to be sarcastic, this is meant to be a portrait of a doofus. But if we find more dark humor, what do you think that means for the Bible audience, the very biblical stories of the imagined audience?
If we find more humor in the Bible, then it depends on the audience. I would like to think that most people who read the Bible have a sense of humor. I know that some don't, and maybe they need to develop one. I mean, listen, as far as I can tell, the thing that we have things that are culturally transmitted. Like we have, hi, how are you? I'm fine, how are you? Like that exchange is culturally transmitted. Laughing is not. We laugh when we're babies. Things entertain us and we laugh. It is coded genetically into our brainstem to laugh. It's almost operating at the same level as fight or flight. It is. Have you ever just laughed at something and you can't stop? It's just that funny, and you are almost out of breath. That has happened to me twice. It happened to me at the Book of Mormon when I saw that on stage, and it happened to me at the South Park movie, which was, of course, made by the guys who made the Book of Mormon. I laughed so hard I almost passed out because I could not breathe. That is biological, right? I can't control that. So I think everybody has a sense of humor. The real question is, are people willing to let things be funny? Can things be funny and still be serious? Can things be critical and still be holy? And this is one of the things that my thesis director taught me. My thesis director was Brian Peckham. He was a Jesuit priest. He was also a brilliant scholar. And he taught me something really interesting. He said, these texts, we were looking at biblical law, and some certain biblical laws are really awful. And he said, these texts are terrible. And it's in countenancing the terribleness of these texts that you find their holiness. Because holiness isn't, about sweet, happy things all the time. Holiness can be about confronting a difficult reality and reckoning yourself with it and positioning yourself on one side of it or another and making moral decisions. I think he's right, and I think that when we laugh at things, we are able to do that, and that's part of the reason why the Bible has a bunch of jokes in it. And not just the ones that I talked about here. There are other ones, too, which we could go into, but I know we're running low on time, so I don't want to do that just yet. But thanks, Kate. I really appreciate that. Oh, by the way, I'm not sure who the audience is, but anytime you have a scene where a bunch of men are farting around a campfire, your audience, at least in some part, is got to be young people. And when we all saw that movie, probably when we were younger, that's the scene that stood out most to us. And it's only as we got older and maybe watched it a second time or a third time, the other stuff stood out more. So I do think his audience is meant to a certain degree to be juvenile, but he also is a smart guy. People who are 14 grow up to be 25, who can grow up to be 40 and grow up to be 50. And they watch films again and again. And that's why Mel Brooks still matters, because people who were 10 or 15 when that movie came out are probably 55 or 60 now, and still watching it and still loving it. It's still relevant, right? So anyway, so that's what I think the audience is for, or what the audience is. Thank you. Good question.
Let me ask you another question. Why do you think it's important to do this kind of contemporary film, contemporary culture analysis and bring it into studying biblical literature?
Because I think you got to keep people interested. Mm-hmm. I teach a course right now. I'm teaching two courses at Temple. One is called Religion in the World. It's just like an intro to religion course. And the other is called A History of the Devil. And that course sold out like you can imagine, A History of the Devil. And of course, as students come in, I always play music as students come into my classes. For this class, I always play rock and roll songs. So of course, the first song coming in was Rolling Stones' Sympathy. Yeah, of course, it had to be. Either that or The Devil Went Down to Georgia. But that's always the second song. So and then they started making suggestions for what should be on the Infernal playlist. And that's what we call it, the Infernal playlist. And we're loading it up to Spotify when it's over. And they've shared music with me. And so what winds up happening is that the songs that we listen to, they sort of establish a framework, a cognitive framework for understanding somebody's relationship to what is about to be discussed within the context of the classroom. Mm-hmm. If you walk into the classroom and you don't make eye contact with students and you say, "Open your books to page 863, and we will see that St. Augustine's," a 19-year-old student who's struggling, to pay their student debt and has got family members who are sick or they're having anxiety issues or whatever, they're not going to be able to connect with that. But when they walk into the classroom, and I was just telling you at the beginning, I play Highway Star by Deep Purple. That's always the first song I play in my Religion of the World class. They're like, rock and roll? What's going on here? It sort of wipes the slate clean, and it gives them an opportunity to realign themselves and to say, whatever class I just came out of, or whatever problem I'm having at home, or whatever difficulty I'm having with my landlord, none of that matters right now because I'm listening to this great song and I wonder where this is going. And then they're invested in the ride, and they go along with you. And the truth is that because of that, I've learned a lot more from my students than I ever thought I would. Because when I'm sitting in front of a room of 30, in this case 77 students in my History of the Devil class, they just know more than I do. And they have much more experience collectively than I do, and they're going to see something that I've never seen before. And invariably, I walk away from that class a couple times a semester, or any class, just going, whoa, I need to rethink this. Mm-hmm. So it makes me a little bit more intellectually accountable. But it's also more fun. And I think it builds community, too, which is something we desperately need.
Any other questions?
We actually got a question on the Zoom.
Okay. Let's see now. How common is it for people not to realize their own inconsistency? My father-in-law's favorite comedian is John Cleese, but he also loves Mel Brooks and Blazing Saddles, yet he's an extreme MAGA nut. I would not let my wife say goodbye to her dying mother because she didn't vote for Trump. What would you think would be the way to help these people realize that this humor is actually about them?
That's a good question. I think some people aren't ready to hear something like that, and I think the best way. I've gone through this. In 2015, 2016, a guy I went to high school with, who had always sort of tilted a little bit to the right, and he got very into guns. And I don't have a problem with that as long as you're not shooting people. I don't care. But he started to really buy some of the propaganda, and he started to believe in the QAnon conspiracy stuff. And I kept on trying to pull him out of it. It was mostly over Facebook, but these conversations were very fraught, and I was very invested in them. But no matter what I said, he wasn't willing to hear it. He would listen to me, but he wouldn't hear me. And what wound up happening is that I gave him permission to continue to cultivate these ideas because I was giving him an audience for them. And I don't think I did him any good. I didn't change him in the end. And I think that the only way you can get people to start thinking about something like this is if there's a chance that they're ready to hear what you have to say. If they're not, I think you might as well be talking to a brick wall. Mm-hmm. At this point, and I told you I didn't want to get real political, but I do think it's impossible to be an academic and not be a little bit political. Classrooms and even public lectures are political spaces, especially at a time when we have politicians trying to monitor what goes on in spaces like this and police people from saying what they think they need to say. So I'm not making this a political space. The powers that be have made this a political space, so I might as well just go with the game. And what I think is this. People who are not ready to hear what you have to say are not going to listen to you. But what they can do is they can expend your energy. They can sap your ability to find joy in your life. They can ruin your resources for taking care of yourself and for nurturing relationships that matter to you. And in the end, I mean, and I've lived through this as I'm sure a lot of you have, like some friendships are worth trying to save, some friendships are not, and some people, you can maintain a relationship with them for whatever reason, and you just have to accept that there are parameters to the relationship and it might not be ideal. And you can just hope against all hope that at some point they'll have a moment of clarity, but that has to come from within. That's not something I think we can impose on people, and certainly not in an academic way. I mean, the last thing anybody who has a very strongly held religious or political commitment wants to hear are a bunch of academic arguments as to why they're not thinking through things effectively. Like, that's just not going to work. It just isn't. And you have to pick your audiences, and you have to pick which hill you're going to die on, too.
That's one of my favorite statements. Choose what hill you want to die on. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I really enjoyed it.
Good.
My question kind of boils down to: do you think Mel Brooks trusts his audience, or like has different like levels of his audience? Because like I'm kind of thinking about the producers a little bit, where if I remember right, it's kind of ambiguous about why the audience loves Springtime for Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
Like it might be like that they see it as a comedy. That seems very likely, but it's kind of ambiguous if I remember right.
But there's this one moment in the film where we are watching Springtime for Hitler, and there's a shot of the audience, and the camera is panning across the audience, and everybody's face is like, oh. So I think in that moment, what he's saying is like, this audience is horrified at the prospect of making fun of World War II and the Holocaust. So I think that was a really important moment, because in that moment, he lets us know that he actually has respect for the audience. He knows that these people are mortified. And at that moment, I think the immediate cut after that is a close-up of Bialystok and Bloom, like, so happy that, like, this show is totally going to tank because, look, the audience hates it. You know, and of course, the second part of the show, the audience loves it, and then it's a hit, and Bialystok says, like, you know, I picked the wrong Hitler, I picked the wrong script, I picked the wrong director. Where did I go right? It's such a beautiful moment. It's such perfect writing, and it reminds me of what Sidney Lumet once said. Sidney Lumet, by the way, a director in New York Jewish theater before he became a film director. He made some truly brilliant American films. He made Network. He made Dog Day Afternoon. He was really a luminary of a filmmaker. He made The Pawnbroker, brilliant movie. Sidney Lumet argued that dialogue and writing, screenwriting, and giving characters lines is inherently cinematic. And I think he's right. You know, I think a good film should use visual language. But I don't think it should eschew dialogue, because there's nothing more human than speaking. That's what makes us human beings. That's what forms human society. And so I think that when Mel Brooks cracks jokes, there's an inherent respect he has for the audience, that the audience is going to get the joke. I mean, the Hedley Lamar joke is hysterical. If you don't know who Hedy Lamarr was, then you'll never get the joke. But he assumes that you do know the joke. And it's just funny that this, like, you know, middle-aged kind of frumpy Jewish guy is conjuring up images of this, like, arguably the most beautiful woman who ever existed in Hollywood, who, by the way, invented what became the internet. She was an absolute genius. She invented frequency hopping, which helped the war effort and led to the development of communication technology that gave us the internet. So she was a complete genius. You know, he knows that we can get the joke, and that's why he makes it. Fart jokes, anybody can get. Like, a 5-year-old can laugh at a fart joke. But Mongo only pawn in Game of Life, you know, that takes a little bit more sophistication, I think. Right.
Okay.
I'm sorry?
They stay.
What?
They do. That's true.
You know, I'm reminded one of the things I argued in my book on scribal curriculum is how much biblical narratives, especially in the Torah, you know, like in Genesis, Exodus, are driven by dialogue. And I'm wondering if you've thought about that, whether you think that those are quote-unquote cinematic? Does that help you think about the text in a different way?
A little bit, yeah. But that's not my idea. That comes from our friend and colleague, Gary Rensburg.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a brilliant colleague who's at Rutgers University, Gary Rensburg. He's forgotten more about the Bible than I'll ever learn. And Gary made the case at one point. It was either in a publication or in a talk. I can't remember which one, but he said that the Bible's dialogue is cinematic, and the Bible itself is cinematic. Mm. It fades in and out, the same way that cinema will fade to black and fade up. And in that black period, the screen's black, time has passed. The Bible does this as well, right? Anytime the Bible says, Vayehi acharei hadvarim ha'eleh, and it was after these things, ... That's like an edit. It's really incredible. The Bible will cut back and forth between type scenes at different times. It will flash forward and flash backwards. Mm-hmm. And we hear about Solomon before Solomon is ever born. In the book of Samuel. I think it's in 2 Samuel 5, right? Mm-hmm. So, the Bible is an inherently cinematic document before cinema ever existed, because there is this sort of creative genius behind so much of the storytelling. Mm-hmm. And, there are other works of world literature that I think kind of border on this as well. It's just the Bible is the most well-known to us because, through an accident of history, it became holy. But the ancient artists and the ancient authors were just as sophisticated as our current authors are. And I really think, and part of the reason why I teach courses on cinema, is that if we read modern film the way we read religious texts, we can learn a lot more about religious texts and religious thinking. And let's be honest, I don't know if you have ever sat in a synagogue service where somebody is talking, but you're far more bothered when you're sitting in a movie theater when somebody is talking. Honestly, if you're in a movie theater and somebody goes, "This is the part where the person does the thing," doesn't that just burn you up? Or if somebody's like opening up a piece of candy just a little bit to, like, you hear the crinkling, it's like, as they're trying to open up their stupid Werther's candy. How can you concentrate on what's happening on screen? It's like they're disrupting your holy moment. And that's far more upsetting to a lot of people than when you're listening to, a sermon and somebody goes, "Are you coming over for lunch later today?" or something like that. That doesn't bother you quite as much. So I do think that there's something inherently ritualistic about watching movies. Mm-hmm. And there's something inherently sacred about film as a medium, as an art form and as a medium of human expression, mm-hmm. that I think some of it can be found in biblical texts even before the technology for cinema as an art form emerged.
Well, I think that's a good place to close this off, and thank Professor Leuchter for his lecture today.
Thank you.